So in the last video we made a very simple Spring Boot application and containerized it in Docker. In this video we're going to use YAML to deploy it to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration system. It can consist of a number of nodes which you can think of as being virtual machines or real machines, and then the nodes contain pods and the pods contain containers. Now we install our microservices into containers, and containers talk to each other via services. So we create containers containing our microservices, and then we create services for the microservices to talk to each other. So in video 1 we were using Docker Desktop, and that comes with a single node Kubernetes. So to get that working, we go into the Docker Desktop UI, click on settings here, and then Kubernetes, and then we click enable Kubernetes. Now it may take a bit of time to start, so you might have to wait for that, but once it's starting we can check that it's working with the kubectl command line. So I'll open up a terminal and type kubectl version. Now once Kubernetes is running, kubectl version should give us a client version and a server version. That means everything's up and running and we're ready to start. Now to define our Kubernetes deployment we're going to use YAML. YAML stands for YAML ain't markup language. It's a markup language like JSON or XML, and basically it works with key value pairs. So we can define key value pairs, and we can also nest keys inside other keys. We can define lists with hyphens, and we can also define maps by just defining key value pairs like this inside a parent key. We can combine these things, so we can do something like this. We can have a list of maps all defined under a parent key. It's all very straightforward. I'm sure you get the hang of it, but the important thing about it is that spacing is very important. So where we have a parent key and then children underneath it, they need to be indented consistently. So you do have to be very careful about your indentation with YAML. Okay, so what we need to do is make a YAML file. So I'll just make it in the project here, new file, and I'll call it mshw.yaml. And now I wouldn't usually be able to remember the format of the YAML file for the deployment, so I'll just cut and paste it. So this is our deployment YAML. So we specify the kind. There's all different kinds that we can deploy into Kubernetes, but in this case it's a deployment. So a deployment is an abstraction over our pods. So we define a deployment, apply the YAML, and that installs a pod. The API version, this is dependent on the kind. We just have to know which API version to use for the kind. Then we can give it a name under metadata key. So I'll just call it mshw deployment. Replicas, this is how many pods we want it to create. We'll just go for one replica for now. And then we define a selector. Now the selector, these are free strings. We can define any key and any value we want here, but this is used when we define the service to select the pod that we want the service to talk to. So I'll just say app mshw. Then we can define the app name here, mshw, and then we specify the containers that we want the deployment to consist of. So in this case we just have one container. We'll name it mshw container. The image mshw, so that is the image, the name of the image that we created when we containerize the application with Docker. So if I do Docker images, I can see that our image is called mshw. That's the one that we're going to be deploying. Image pull policy, if not present. So that means we'll pull from Docker Hub if the image is not present. Because we've already got the image locally in Docker, we won't be pulling it. We'll just be taking it from the local image. and the container port 8085. That was the external port that we defined in the Docker deployment, so not the internal port, the port into the Docker image, but we're just using 8085 throughout. So that's the definition of our deployment. Now in YAML we can specify more things to deploy with 3 hyphens like that. So this is a separate section, and this is defining the service. So this time API version is v1 for kind service, and we'll name our service MSHW service. We'll put the service on port 80, so that's the port that we are coming into the service, and the target port is 8085, and then the selector will matches the things that we've put in the selector up here for the replica. So we'll say app MSHW, and then the service knows that it's for this deployment. Now I'm just going to make a few changes to this. This service definition is actually defining an internal service. The default service type is a cluster IP, and we don't want that because we want to be able to access the service externally from outside the Kubernetes cluster. So I'm just going to say here that I want to type node port, and here I'm going to define a node port of 30,000. Now there is a restriction, it's from 30,000 to 32,767 or something like that. So we have to define ports in that range for the node port type. So the node port allows people outside of the Kubernetes cluster to visit the service. It's not the best way of doing things, and in the next video we'll look at ingress, which is the correct way of doing things. But for now, just to test that our application is deployed properly, we'll use a node port type of service. So that's our YAML file to deploy the pod and the service in Kubernetes. So to deploy it, we cd into the folder, so I'm in the folder with the YAML, and we do kubectl apply -f for file and mshw.yaml, and there it tells us the deployment was created and the service was created. Now if we change things in the YAML file and reapply it, it will only change the things that have changed. So for example, if we change replicas to 3 but we don't change the service, and we apply the file again, it will say that the deployment is configured but the service is unchanged. So I'll just change that back to 1, and again, deployment configured and service is unchanged. So that's pretty useful. So if you do make changes, it doesn't have to update everything. Now if I do kubectl get all, we can see what we've deployed. So we have a deployment. This is a pod here. It says it's ready and it's running. Sometimes you do have to wait for things to be ready, but this pod is running. We have a service, that's just a Kubernetes service, and this is our service, MSHW service, as we named it there. And we have the deployment there, and here we have a replica set. That is the set of replicas. We have just one, desired one, current one, ready one. So now we have that deployed. I'm going to visit localhost on 30,000, which was the external port, and there we see hello world. So now our application is running inside Kubernetes. So there's a lot of things we can do with kubectl, and over the course of the next few videos we'll be going into much more detail, but for now I'll just demonstrate a few things. If we just wanted to get the pods, for example, we could do kubectl get pods, we could do kubectl get services, and we can also delete things. So for example, if we do kubectl delete deployment and then use the name that we've named it in here, MSHW deployment, that will delete our deployment. Our service will still be there, so if we do kubectl get all, we still have our service. I can delete that with delete service, MSHW service. So that's the service deleted, and we're back to the beginning. But we will be going into much more detail about kubectl in the next few videos. But for now, I hope you can see that deploying things with YAML in Kubernetes is quite straightforward. We're not doing it quite right here by using this node port service, and we'll look at that in the next video where we'll be looking at ingress. So thanks for watching.